Internal Revenue Service IRS Tax News. Tools to help people get their economic impact payment. COVID Tax Tip 2020-48, April 30th, 2020. The IRS has two tools to help millions of taxpayers with their economic impact payment. There's a link to that here. There'll be a link to this in the description. Back to the text. The payments are $1,200 per eligible person and up to $500 for each qualifying child. The first tool, non-filers enter payment info here, link to that here, is available in English and Spanish for certain taxpayers who don't normally need to file a tax return. So the general thought process to go through as to whether you would use this tool would be, did I file a 2019 income tax return? If I did, then I wouldn't use the tool. If I did not, then maybe, right? Did I file 2018 tax return? If I did, then I typically wouldn't use the tool. If I did not, then maybe. If I didn't file 2019 or 2018, the question is, am I required to file? Did I choose not to refile even though I'm required to do so, which happens? But if you're required to file the tax return and did not do so, then once again, you wouldn't be using the tool. You'd have to actually file the tax return because this isn't an actual tax return. This is just informational stuff for the IRS. Then, if you didn't file 2019, didn't file 2018, and you're not required to, most likely because your taxable income is under a certain amount, therefore not required to file, the question is, do you get payments from some other area, such as Social Security, SSI, or VA assistance or something like that? If you do, typical rule would be that you wouldn't normally need to file because the IRS is working with those institutions to process the check, and they know who you are, they know you're under the taxable income limitation, and so they should be able to process the check unless you're in some kind of weird situation, not weird, but just some kind of situation where the IRS doesn't have your information. Like if you have a qualifying child under that type of situation, the IRS wouldn't have it. We'll talk about that in more depth, but in any case, if you didn't file 2019, 2018, and you don't get payments from any other institution like SSI, Social Security, or VA, then you would think that this would be the tool that you would want to use in order to give the information to the IRS rather than filing the tax returns. That's the general rule. We'll get into more details and scenarios as we go back to the text. This free tool allows them to enter basic information so the IRS can issue their payment. The second tool, Get My Payment, allows people to check the status of their payment and provide bank account information if a payment has not been scheduled for delivery. So the Get My Payment then is going to be the tool that you can go in there and say, hey, where is my payment? What's the status of my payment? Has my payment been processed? If you're thinking about using a tool such as the non-filer enter information tool, then once the payment has been processed, it's basically going to be too late to then use the tool up top. So you want to check the Get My Payment tool, and you can see if anything's been processed and what the payment process has been. Also, if the payment has not yet been processed and you want to get it faster, you may use that tool to provide the banking information to get the direct deposit rather than getting the information by mail. So in other words, if you don't need to file it, or if you have filed the tax return, or you're working, or you get payments from the VA or something like that, then the payment should go out, but you might say, hey, look, they're giving it to me by mail, and it's taking too long right now because I know the IRS is under-personed, and therefore that's going to take too long. I want to get it faster at this point in time. Then you might be able to use this tool to get the direct deposit information in that case and hopefully speed up the payment. But you can only do that before the payment has actually been scheduled. If the payment has been scheduled, then you may not be able to use these tools at that point in time. It's going to be too late for it. Back to the text. Who needs to use the non-filers enter payment info here? So taxpayers with low or no income, those who don't normally file a tax return include those with little or no income. Those include single filers who made under $12,200 and married couples who made less than $24,400. So who would typically use this tool? Typically people that have lower income under the threshold for which they would need to be filing. And that would typically be people, if single, under $12,200 of taxable income typically, and $24,400 if married of the taxable income. Now, if you're under this threshold, then you probably didn't file. You may not have filed your tax returns, and that's fine. And then, because you're not typically required to, but then you've got to think, well, am I getting payments from some other government institution like Social Security, VA, or something like that. If you are, then the IRS typically has the general information in order to process the check, usually for an individual, $12,200. So if there's some other kind of situation going on, we'll talk a little bit more about those in a second, then you may have to provide more information. But the $12,200, they should typically be able to process that and give it to the same, processing, the same address or the same payment format, however you're getting the payments from whatever institution you're getting them from. They should be able to process that in a similar way. If you're not getting payments from anybody else and you're under this threshold and you're not required to file, therefore, then you'd want to use this tool so that you can tell the IRS who you are, what the payment information is, and allow them the information to process that and get the payment out. Back to the text. Taxpayers who receive federal benefits, eligible SSI and veteran beneficiaries who usually don't file a tax return don't need to provide information to get a $1,200 payment automatically. So once again, if you don't file because you're under this income limitation, at least with regards to taxable income, but you do get money from, say, the SSA or veteran beneficiaries, then you typically would not need to be using this tool because the IRS has that information unless there's something that they don't have. So the IRS knows enough about you. They know that, who you are, where to process the payment, and they would process the typical $12,200 payment. So if there's some other circumstance where the payment would be different than that, then you might have to give them added information. We'll talk more about that in a second. Back to the text. However, VA and SSI benefit recipients who don't normally file a tax return and have children should use the free tool by May 5th. So that's going to be one of the scenarios. So again, if you get payments from the VA or something, the IRS can get enough information to know, without a tax return, to know that you're an individual and you're getting payments and you haven't filed. So they assume that you're not required to file, and therefore they're just going to process the standard check of $1,200. But if you have a qualifying child, one that's under 17, the IRS doesn't know about that, and so the IRS you're going to have to give that information. That's one of the special circumstances that they're going to need more information so that you can get the added $500 per qualifying child. Back to the text. This will add the $500 per qualifying child under 17 to the automatic payments. If they miss the May 5th deadline, they will have to file a tax return next year for the 2020 to receive the $500 per child. So you might say, what happens if I don't do that? If you've already received the economic impact payment and you haven't provided that added information for the $500 for the qualifying child, you might say, hey, I'll just do it now, and then you guys just send me the check, after I file it. And the IRS is saying they're not going to do that because this tool apparently is only designed to be giving them the added information up to the point that the check is sent. So once the check goes out, this tool basically goes away. It's disappeared. It's no longer something that you can use. Can you still get the $500 after that point? Yeah, but it's harder because then you have to file the 2020 tax return, and you don't normally file a tax return because you're not normally required to do so. Put the dependent on the tax return, and then you'll be able to get it. So it'll take longer, and you'll have to actually go through a longer process filing the tax return rather than just do this informational tool. So you'd really like to do it beforehand, because if people miss that deadline, they're probably less likely to get the $500 because they're probably not going to be filing the tax return if they don't typically do so to do it. But you could. So just be aware of that. Back to the text. Married individuals must provide additional information for their spouse to claim the full $2,400 payment if their spouse doesn't receive SSA, SSDI, RRB, SSI, or VA benefits in 2019 and didn't have to file a tax return in the last 2 years. So this one's probably one of the less common kind of areas, but it would seem more common, and it's probably one of the more confusing ones. So let's see if we can break this thing down, right? We're going to say, all right, so we have two individuals, they're married, and one individual qualifies for the SSA, SSDI, RRB, SSI, one of these other institutions. You didn't file a tax return, so the IRS doesn't know you're married, right? They don't know, and they don't know anything about you other than you're going to get a payment from one of these institutions and you didn't file a tax return. And therefore, the assumption is you're not required to file a tax return because you must be under the limit of taxable income is the assumption. They know how to process the payment, who to process the payment to. So they're just going to send out a payment, typically as if you're a single individual, $1,200. Now, you might say, well, but I'm married. What about that? I'm married. Well, if the spouse if the spouse too didn't file a 2019 or 2018 tax return, and if they're getting some payment from one of these institutions, it's the same thing. The IRS doesn't know about them. They don't know that they're married, but they know that they're a single individual. They know that they're a person, a citizen, that's qualified to get a payment. They know they didn't file a tax return. They don't have the Social Security number, whether it be a married return or a single return. And so what they're going to do is just process them a $1,200 payment. So most people, are still probably going to work out for them to not do anything, and that would typically be because the IRS is just going to send out two $1,200 payments as if they were single. If you have two individuals that didn't file a tax return, that get payments from one of these institutions, right? The IRS is just going to send out two $1,200 checks. Typically, that's going to be my assumption. That's my interpretation of what would happen under that circumstance, given the information that the IRS has. So if you have two different individuals that are married, but they're both getting some kind of payments, but they didn't file a tax return, the IRS doesn't know they're married, but they should both get, payments, you would think, because the IRS is going to assume they're both single and give them the $1,200. But what if you have a married couple and one of them qualifies for the SSI and SSDI, whatnot, but the other doesn't get any of these payments, right? So now the IRS knows about one individual, but not the other. They don't know they're married because they didn't file a tax return. They know one individual is getting payments, so they're just going to send out the payment based on what they know, $1,200 check. The other individual is completely outside what they know. They don't know anything about them because they didn't file a tax return, and they're not getting any of these payments. So the other individual's off radar here. So that means that to get the payment, then the other individual, you'd have to tell the IRS that you're married. So in that kind of special circumstance, to get the full $2,400, twice the individual, the spouse doesn't have any information, you need to tell them that you're married in that kind of situation. So that's going to be, again, I don't think that's the most but it's probably a fairly common type of situation. One of the more confusing ones. But in any case, back to the text. They need to provide this information using the non-filer tool before the payment is scheduled. Otherwise, their payment at this time will be $1,200. Should these groups use the non-filer interpayment info tool? Taxpayers who have already filed or who are required to file a 2019 tax return should not use this tool. So, in other words, if you filed 2019, then you shouldn't use this tool. You're going to confuse the IRS because this tool is only geared towards people that not only didn't file but aren't required to file. If you didn't file if you filed either 2019 or 2018, then you would think that you'd be, they would be able to calculate the payment. Back to the text. Using this tool will not speed up their economic impact payment and will likely slow down the processing of their tax return and receiving any refund. So you might think, hey, if I was to use this tool, maybe it'll make things faster, and it probably won't, because again, the IRS is what's going to happen if you just think about the IRS's side of things. They're going to say, okay, now we've got someone who typically is required to file a tax return. They filed a tax return, so they're going to see their computer's just going to pick it up, right? It's all automatic. Their computer's going to say, well, we got two Social Security numbers telling us conflicting data. One Social Security number is telling us they filed a tax return and therefore is required to do so. The other Social Security number is using this tool, which is indicating that they're not required to file a tax return. The IRS is going to get into gridlock. Their computer head's going to blow up, right? It doesn't know what to do. So that's going to cause a problem. It's not going to make things faster. It's going to make things slower. Back to the text. People who already received their payment, even if they did not receive the full amount, should not use this tool. So you might think, okay, I got the payment, but I'm in that kind of category where I've got a qualifying child, where I want the plus 500. They already gave me the payment. What I'll do is I'll just use this tool, and then they can just give me the payment as soon as they get it, and they'll just give me the added 500, which makes sense, but that's not the way it works. The IRS is basically saying, we're not doing that. They're saying the tool is only useful up until the point in time that the payment is scheduled. After that point in time, the tool goes away. So if you got a payment and the payment's not right, the payment amount is not proper, you should have gotten more or something like that, the tool is of no use at this point in time. You're going to have to do another recourse, which may be actually filing a tax return at a later point. That's why you really want to use the tool before the payment is processed if it's not too late and you're in that circumstance. Back to the text. Those who can be claimed as a dependent on someone else's 2019 tax return are not eligible for the payment and should not use this tool. So this includes a lot of people, unfortunately. Like if you're a student, for example, you're going to say, okay, I'm a student, I'm over 17, I got, but I can still be claimed on my parents' tax return, and that's beneficial for taxes typically. So you would think that either the parent would get some kind of benefit, like the plus 500, or the student would get some kind of benefit for filing a tax return. But that's not the case because they're a dependent on their parents' tax return. Therefore, they can't use this tool. It doesn't matter, they're not going to get the payment for it, and the parent's not going to get any benefit for that because they're not a qualifying child. They're over 17. So those kind of people, or that situation is a little, they're not going to get a payment. It is what it is. Back to the text. How to use the non-filers. Enter payment info here. The process is simple and it only takes a few minutes to complete and submit the request for their economic impact payment. First, taxpayers should visit irs.gov and go to non-filers, enter payment info here, and then provide basic information. The IRS will use this information to confirm the taxpayer's eligibility, calculate, and send them a payment. So obviously, if you're using this tool, then typically you're someone that didn't file a tax return and you don't have an income limitation thing. So they're not looking for your taxable income. All they really need to know is say, hey, who is this person? Is this a real person? Are they eligible for this type of payment? Which means you got to tell them who you are to the IRS. And obviously the government thinks of you as some kind of number. So whatever number they think of you as, you're going to have to, of course, give them that. And then you're going to have to give them the basic information for the calculation, which is just basically, usually that's me. It's me. I'm one individual. Give me the 1,200 typically, right? Or unless you have a qualifying child, or in that case where you have are married and you're not both getting separate payments in some kind of way, right? So you're going to have to give them that information, and then the payment information, either send the check, mail it out, or banking information would be faster if you had that. And that's basically it. You don't need the full tax return. You don't need to be having your W-2 information and whatnot, you would think, right? Because they don't need that. They just need to know to confirm who you are. Back to the text. No tax will be owed on economic impact payments. So you might think, hey, if I get a $1,200 payment, am I going to have to pay taxes on that at the end of the year? Typically, the answer would generally be no. It's not taxable income, even though it's kind of like income. It's not taxable income. Back to the text. It will not reduce taxpayers' refund or increase the payment owed when on the 2020 tax return filed next year. It will not affect income for purposes of determining eligibility for federal government assistance or benefit programs. So many people might be in that situation as well, where you're saying, hey, look, I'm getting benefit payments from people. If I get any more taxable income or any kind of eligible income, it's going to mess up my benefit payments in some kind of way because now that's included in the type of income I have and whatnot. So that's all, so they're saying it shouldn't affect the calculations for the benefit type of payments either.